Hello, how are you doing? I had a bit of a surprise this morning when I went online, looked at my news notifications, and saw that BBC Culture had posted its Best Books of the Year list. And I thought, oh, great. So I went and looked at this list and then thought, oh, some of these look very familiar, not just the selections, but the actual descriptions of these different books. And then I realized that this was a list that I had looked at the mid-year point this year in June and had done a whole video about commenting on these books, but it didn't include all of these titles. So obviously this is a list that these journalists have just been adding to over the course of the year, which is a really interesting way of compiling Best Books of the Year list. So when I looked at this list in June, there was only 14 titles there, and currently there are 39 Best Books of the Year that they've listed. I don't know if they have a limit point, if they're going to get to 50 and then they'll just say that's all the best books that we're going to put onto this list, or if they're just going to keep continuing indefinitely as the journalists read more books, and if they consider them some of the greatest of the year, they're just going to keep putting them on. I don't know, but yeah, so currently at 39, but I thought it would be fun to do a sort of updated video on this particular list and talk about the 25 additional books that have gone on here since then. I'll put a link to the previous video I did below if you want to hear me discussing the 14 other books on that list. Now, at the time when I made that video, I hadn't read the novel Glory yet, but read it soon after making that video and just loved this novel so much, and it was my favorite to win the Booker Prize before the long list for this year was even announced. So I was so happy that it made both the long list and the short list. Of course, there was another book which I'll be discussing briefly, which I'd read in the interim period before the winner was announced, that I was glad made it. But yeah, I'll talk more about that later. But yeah, I was glad that was a novel I was looking forward to already. But when I'd seen this list previously in June, it sort of pushed me as reminded me like, oh yeah, I need to go get a copy of that book. So I did, and then read it, and yeah, it was great. So that's why I really enjoy looking and continuing to follow lists like this, even if they keeping added to over the course of the year. So looking at the 25 additional books, starting off with the novel Fairy Tale by Stephen King. So I have to say right off the bat, as somebody who was born and raised in the state of Maine, obviously Stephen King is a local hero of mine, and being from Maine, you sort of have to be proud of Stephen King, and I am proud of him. Although I have to admit, I've not read any of his books since I was an adolescent or a teenager, and that's not because I'm not interested in them. They just haven't been such a big priority for me, but I do really like the sound of this novel, which is about a 17-year-old boy whose mother died in a tragic accident, and his father is suffering from alcoholism. He meets someone who introduces him to a portal to an entirely another world and an empire that is suffering from a particular disease. And this was written during the time of the recent pandemic, so is obviously partly influenced by that, but is kind of a mashup and a genre-bending book that traverses different universes of our reality and then a kind of fantasy realm, which does sound really intriguing. So I'll be keen to look at some other reviews of this book before I decide I want to pick back up on Stephen King. Next is the most recently published book in English by the current Nobel Prize laureate for literature, Annie Ernaux, the amazing French author. Her book, Getting Lost. Now, a little over a year ago, on the day that the Nobel Prize for Literature was going to be announced in 2021, I had a suspicion that Annie Ernaux might win the Nobel Prize that year. I mean, she was touted as a sort of favorite. So that morning, I decided to read her book, Simple Passion, and she didn't win last year, but she did win this year. And I made a whole video about this book and why I found it so powerful. And it actually connects to this new book, Getting Lost, which, so this is an account, Simple Passion is her account of having an affair, but the person she had an affair with remains anonymous throughout this book, but in Getting Lost, this was the actual diary she kept during the time of having this affair, and so you can see all of the diary entries in there, and she does name him in this, and so gets into a lot more detail about this all-consuming affair which just completely took up her life and was so important to her, but then looking at it in retrospect, sees it in a very different lens. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to reading more of her thoughts about this and this subject matter. She takes a really interesting perspective, I think, in sort of not passing moral judgment on the situation, but just more talking about this human condition of love and passion that we get so swept up in. And she writes about it in such an incisive and really striking way, such an intelligent way that, yeah, looking forward to reading more of her work. And so, yeah, I just went to Foyles the other day to pick up this copy, and it was actually a signed copy of the book. So very glad to have this. Nightcrawling by Leila, Mottley, and this novel I'd read, speaking of the Booker Prize, I'd read just before the Booker long list was announced this year, and I just loved this book so much, so I was thrilled to see it on this year's Booker list. The story of a 17-year-old teenage girl that is living in Oakland, California, whose father is absent, whose mother is struggling quite a lot. So it falls upon her to help care and financially support herself and her brother, who is going through issues of his own. And so she takes to walking the street and selling her body, and then has encounters with the police, and then it becomes a much more complicated and dangerous situation. So it's following that story, which is based on a real life account that occurred in this area. And yeah, Leila Mottley is such a wonder to be such a young writer, to have written this only in her late teenage years, and to have created this book which is so poetic and powerful and beautiful as well as heart-wrenching. It's just incredible. Now, you could say the journalists that have been compiling this list have just sort of shoved over the Booker Prize long list onto their lists of the best books of the year, or maybe these books are being put on a list like this and have been given prize attention because they're so extraordinary. I don't know which the answer is, but anyway, here is another book that appeared on the Booker Prize long list after Sappho by Selby, Wynn, Schwartz. This novel/nonfiction account about a group of European women in the before and after the beginning of the 20th century, and the way that they fashioned identities for themselves through time, through influencing each other, through having been influenced by the great poet Sappho. And so, yeah, looking at this relationship of women to each other, but also the formation of identity. So slightly challenging to read about if you don't know much about these women already, and to keep them all straight in your mind as she goes through quite a number of different individuals, but really fascinating. Our Missing Hearts by Celeste, the latest book from this very popular novelist. This is a dystopian novel set in a future America where people are condemned for their un-American activities, and it follows the story of a boy whose mother was a poet and has gone missing, and his father is a talented linguistics professor that's been reduced to just stacking books, and he goes on a quest to find his mother, and there gets introduced to this underground network of renegade librarians, which sounds like a fantastic story. The only other book I've read by this author I thought was okay, and yeah, I've heard very mixed things about this book, but I am curious by that story premise. The Seven Moons of Maali, Almeida by Shehan, Karunatilaka, this joyous, wondrous weird novel about a wartime photographer journalist in Sri Lanka who has just recently died, and we follow him in his afterlife on a quest to discover who killed him, to reconnect with his loved ones and friends, and also uncover some photographs he took which he believes will shake the foundations of the current government. And it's kind of a genre-defined book. It's a mystery, but it's also kind of a horror story, as well as like political satire and social chronicle, and but also a larger investigation into the nature and meaning of life, and the how we deal as individuals in a time of war and a country that's so politically divided, so has so many applications, and just this story completely swept me away. I made a whole video about it, which I sort of, when I created the video, I just thought like, oh, who's going to be interested in hearing about this novel, which was put out by a small publisher and not many people have heard of, although it was listed for the Booker Prize. But now that video has had over 10,000 views, and I'm so glad that so many people are reading and discovering this absolutely fantastic novel. Now, next is a novel that a lot of people were disappointed wasn't shortlisted and didn't win this year's Booker Prize, which is The Colony by Audrey Magee. It is one of the best novels that I'd read this year, like even before the whole Booker hoopla, that I thought is such an amazing novel, and a story of a small island off from Ireland, and two strangers that kind of traveled to this island, you could say, like infiltrate it with their opinions and ideas, and how that clashes with the locals, and looks at this larger conversation to do with culture and colonialism and the meaning of that in different ways, but also is such an engaging story with very endearing characters that I just grew to love. The Last White Man by Mohsin Hamid. The author takes his inspiration for this book from Kafka's Metamorphosis, where it follows the story of a white man in small town United States who wakes up one morning to find that his skin has become dark, and so it follows the consequences of that to explore these issues to do with identity and race. And I've found that from the books I've read in the past by this author, his sort of commentary is a bit too on the nose, but he does approach these issues in a really creative way. So I would be interested to read this, but it's not sort of the top of my priority reading list. Trust by Hernan Diaz, another book which is kind of genre defined in as being of a sort of social chronicle, but also a time-bending story about an elite couple in the United States in the early 1900s, but looks at their story and the meaning of how they came to so much wealth from different perspectives. And I still have not read this, even though it was listed for the Booker Prize. But a friend of mine who was reading through the entire Booker list said that this is one of his favorite books that he read this year. So it's a novel that I still really want to get to. Best of Friends by Kamila Shamsie. I've really enjoyed books from this author in the past, so I really need to get a copy of her new novel, which follows the story of the friendship of two women over the course of their life, from being teenagers in Pakistan to living as 40-somethings in London, and looking at the course of that friendship, how it changes over time, and the different ways that these different women approach life. So really looking forward to reading this story. Booth by Karen Joy Fowler, this historical novel which looks at the siblings of John Wilkes Booth, who assassinated President Lincoln, and the story of John Booth himself and his upbringing. He's referred to as Johnny in this novel, looking at the difficult lives of his parents and this theatrical family, and from all of the different perspectives of the different siblings. And I found it really compelling, absorbing story. I know some other readers found it a bit exhausting, but I was really compelled by it. Shrines of Gaiety by Kate Atkinson. This novel is set in the interwar period in London when the city in Soho was consumed by dancers, drinkers, and gangsters, and a woman who is sort of known as the queen of nightlife in Soho. It follows her story and her entrepreneurial spirit, as well as the plans she makes for her children. And so, yeah, it sounds like a really compelling historical story. And I just picked up a copy of this recently from a local bookshop. It's an independent bookstore copy that's signed with these nice like blue edges. Cult Classic by Sloane Crosley, a novel that's described as an anti-rom-com because it's about love, luck, and hipsterdom in New York City, and a kind of satire on millennial internet culture. It gives me kind of Patricia Lockwood vibes. I don't know if that's a fair comparison, but I wasn't the biggest fan of Patricia Lockwood's No One Is Talking About This, but I don't know. I'll be interested to hear responses from other readers. Let me know if you've read this and enjoyed this novel, and if you think I would like it. Young Mungo by Douglas Stuart, this queer Romeo and Juliet heartbreaking love story about two teenage boys in Glasgow in the 1990s, one from a Protestant family, one from a Catholic family, had their connection with each other, and even past that kind of blurb or your expectations about what this story will be. Actually, reading this novel, I found it so surprising and moving. Their connection with each other, the physical and emotional connection and bonds they form together, and the very dramatic things that occur in this story. This novel just swept me away. The Candy House by Jennifer Egan. I always say of these best books of the year lists that if a novel appears on multiple lists, it's probably a very good sign, and every list I've seen has included this book, which is the story of a CEO internet giant who happens upon this technology where memories can be externalized and downloaded. So he capitalizes on that, and it's about the consequences of that. And yeah, such an intriguing story. They also say that the underlying temptation metaphor of Hansel and Gretel's candy house permeates the book, which is such an enticing description. Either Or by Elif Batuman, another book which has appeared on multiple best books of the year lists, but I have to admit the author's previous book, The Idiot, I admired but didn't totally fall in love with, so I'm not sure how I'm going to feel about this sequel following the same central character who's going to Harvard and following her observations and kind of the mishaps as she tries to figure out what she wants in her life, both professionally and in love and in terms of education. And so yeah, I'd be curious to read this, but again, it's not top of my priority list. Constructing a Nervous System by Margo Jefferson. This is a book I keep really meaning to get a copy of. It's a blend of memoir and criticism where the author explores her family history as well as jazz artists and writers that she really admires. So she has such an interesting perspective. I've really appreciated books of hers that I've read in the past. So yeah, I do definitely want to read this. In Love, a memoir of love and loss by Amy Bloom. This is an autobiographical account in which the author describes very candidly the heart-wrenching journey of trying to aid her husband in ending his life when he receives a diagnosis of Alzheimer's in the year 2019. So it's following that journey and uses an innovative structure to tell this story, moving backwards and forwards in time. This sounds like a very difficult book to read, but very moving. I read another memoir recently called Ti Amo, which is also about a woman giving an account of her husband suffering from terminal cancer, and so yeah, I think this will be, yeah, I don't know if I'll be able to read this right away, but I do want to get to it at some point because I've read a book by Amy Bloom in the past and I thought it was so powerful, so I do really admire her writing. Love Marriage by Monica Ali, and this wonderful novel which I read early on this year and just completely fell for the story of a young woman who's a junior doctor who's also engaged to be married, and it's about meeting her in-law or her future mother-in-law, and the journey of this couple's parents meeting and all the dramatic things that occur after that, but also her difficulty in the medical profession in England and trying to become a doctor, and as a woman of Asian heritage, of dealing with the responses she gets from some patients, and is a really wonderful story about contemporary Britain, but also this fascinating, really wonderful character and how it examines her own preconceptions and her own misgivings about life in a really interesting way, as well as giving this broader picture about our contemporary society. Tiepolo Blue by James Cahill, a novel about a art historian in his 40s who's living in Cambridge, who has never really explored his own sexuality, but then he has an encounter with a young artist, and this sends him on a spiral and a journey which he never anticipated, and so yeah, I'm so curious to read this novel. Been really meaning to get to it. Then there is a nonfiction book, Fire Island: Love, Loss, and Liberation in an American Paradise by Jack Parlett. So this is an account of the famous island in New York, which is a sort of queer party scene during the summer, and so it gives an account of this sort of culture and this physical space, which I've always found really curious in that there's no real British equivalent to this place, I don't think, and I have some British friends who moved to America and then got very involved in the whole Fire Island scene, and I'm just a bit mystified by all of it and don't really understand it, and I don't think I would ever really want to go there, though I think it's wonderful that this place exists. But I mean, there was a fictional film recently called Fire Island, which shows the small-mindedness of some people on this party scene, but also the liberation and the togetherness that can be found in the gay community there, which is really wonderful, but definitely like a double-edged sword to it all. So I would be interested to read and learn more about this area and this whole culture. Pure Color by Sheila Heti, a short novel which I feel like I don't entirely understand what this book is about, even though I've read a number of blurbs about it and reviews of it of people that have discussed it, because this is kind of a slippery to get to the subject matter at the heart of this book. It's described here as an aspiring art critic meets and falls in love with a woman named Annie, who opens up Mira's chest to a portal with her enormous power. So I'm not sure what to expect from this book, but I am really curious to discover for myself. Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel, and this is another novel which seems to have so many things going on in it, it's quite difficult to summarize. It begins in the year 1912 when a British immigrant moves and makes a new life for themselves in Canada, but then encounters a sort of paranormal experience. It moves forward to the present day as well as to future time periods. So yeah, again, another book that I'm not entirely sure what to expect from, but I did really admire and enjoy the novel station Generation 11, so I've been wanting to read more of her work. Memphis by Tara M. Stringfellow. This is a debut novel which was shortlisted for the Waterstones' very first debut novel prize, and it follows the story of 3 generations of Black American women. It spans a 70-year time period and shows their connection to each other, but also conflicts that they encounter between each other and the larger country. I am really intrigued by this book, but I've heard quite mixed reviews of it, so yeah, I am hoping to read it at some point. Then there is the poetry collection Time is a Mother by Ocean Vaughn. This collection was written after the author's mother had died, so it was looking at issues to do with personal loss, but also the meaning of family. Ocean Vaughn's poetry collection, Night Sky with Exit Wounds, is definitely one of the best poetry books I've ever read in my life. So yeah, definitely excited and interested to read this new collection, which has such a beautiful cover, and yeah, what an amazing title for a book. So those are the additional books that have been added to this list. The first 15 previous books I did talk about in that previous video, so like I said, there's a link to that below if you want to hear me discuss those other books. Out of these 39 books currently on this list, I have only read 10 of them, but yeah, like I've been talking about, a lot more that I want to get to and hopefully read before the end of this year. If not before the end of this year, sometime in the future. There's no pressure to read books right away. I mean, books will always just stay there, and that's the good thing about books and lists like this, that they'll continuously remind us that, oh yeah, that's a title that we should get back to. Anyway, I'll stop prattling on. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see before the end of the year if even more books are added to this list. Let me know in the comments below if you happen to notice any of them, but also let me know if you've read any of these books, if you would also recommend them, or if there are other titles that you think really deserve a place on the best books of the year list. Yeah, let me know about those in the comments below. But thank you for watching. I hope you're doing well, reading good things, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.